So, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the stolen and unceded traditional territory of the Massachusetts, land that was also traversed by the Narragansett, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and many others. I also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land. I also want to acknowledge that we have another leading comrade visiting us from New York, Imani Henry, who is, by the way, out of Boston, okay? So, we didn't forget about it. Boston's produced a lot of great people nationally in Workers' World Party. So, happy International Working Women's Day. Water is life. Mini Wachani. I want to dedicate my talk this afternoon to Berta Cáceres, an Indigenous defender of the land and water who was murdered by the Honduran government and paramilitaries, and to all the Indigenous and other water and land protectors throughout these continents, and to our Afro-Brazilian sister, Mariela Franco, who has just been assassinated. And also to remember especially our relatives in Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Palestine, especially the women and children who are imprisoned by the Zionists there. Finally, I want to express my solidarity with Black struggles here and around the world. It has been exciting to read about South Africa recently and how they're beginning the very necessary process of taking land back from white farmers there, from the settlers, so that African people would have more land, which is what they need and deserve. This hunger for the return of the land is strong amongst colonized and formerly colonized peoples everywhere. The question of land is central. When settlers dispossess people of their land, it means trying to disappear a whole people. It means starvation. It means not being able to support yourself. The theft of land is what supports all other social realities on that land. So, sometimes, though, progressive people here do not realize that they too are living on stolen land. Stolen land is not something that just happens somewhere else. We have multiple oppressed nations within the U.S., and all of our struggles here are happening on stolen land. The issue of protecting the land and returning the land to Indigenous nations is a fundamental one that underlies everything. I want to review for just a minute what settler colonialism is here in this country that is currently known as the United States. I believe someday we're going to have another name for it. Because you have to believe and dream in addition to struggling and being out on the street. We got to have that, you know?
That's right.
So, you know, we look at things through a lot of different prisms. We look at things through the prism of class and race, or the construct of race. We look at things certainly through a Marxist-Leninist viewpoint, if we're socialist. There's all these tools that we use to look at our history, how we got here, who we are, how we fit into the society, all those kind of things. And the understanding of settler colonialism is another tool that can be used along with that. And I think it's an important tool. Some people have, I think, thought that it was more of just an academic thing or an academic exercise that you learn about maybe if you take a class in Indigenous Studies in college, but I disagree with that because I'm not an academic, and frankly, and I find it, as do most Indigenous people throughout the Americas, to be a fundamental tool for understanding a lot of things. So I just want to, if you don't know what settler colonialism is, I just want to explain that because I would never assume that anybody would know what that means because it's not something we hear that much. So here, and it differs from place to place too. So here we have Indigenous peoples who are from many nations. We also have Indigenous peoples here, by the way, who have migrated from Mexico and El Salvador and other countries. And they're crossing borders that certainly never existed for any of us historically. We have settlers who stole the land and eradicated millions of native peoples, whether it was here in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims and the Puritans and all those folks, or out in Oregon or California or Florida, elsewhere. settlers intend to stay, and they often supplant the indigenous populations. Settlers become the law. They become the government. They supplant our own indigenous laws and beliefs with their own values. Now, I've heard it said by some people that everyone who is not indigenous is a settler. And I want to say that is wrong and that is stupid. I try not to say something stupid, but it's just ignorant. We have millions. First of all, we have millions of stolen people.
Thank you.
Or sometimes they're called arrivants in more academic terminology, but stolen people who were forced here through colonial violence, which in the U.S. would predominantly be black people. Certainly black people are not settlers. It's ignorant to even have that thought, I think. But now, sometimes the stolen people are utilized to enforce settler colonialism, such as in the case of the Black Buffalo Soldiers who were sent to kill and control indigenous people on the plains. There are, in turn, indigenous people who participated in the anti-blackness that also runs through the society here. And there were even some members of the Cherokee and Choctaw and some other nations in the Southeast who held black slaves. We have also newcomers who came here after the slaughter and displacement, the initial waves of slaughter and displacement of indigenous peoples. Now, even those who are not settlers, though, such as the newcomers, usually will adopt much of the worldview of settlers, and they benefit from settler colonialism in some way. Settler colonialism has also here been the pathway for the economic system of capitalism to come here. And religion has often been used as a weapon to enforce these viewpoints. So when we look at the role of Christianity with indigenous communities, we see that it was to wipe out all of our beliefs and enforce a totally different worldview. I'm not being, if you believe in Christianity, that's fine. I'm just saying how it was used. Now, settler colonialism is not just something that happened in the past. It is ongoing. It is happening right now. It is really important to remember that. And as one of my favorite writers, Art Manuel, wrote, he said, colonialism has three components: dispossession, dependence, and oppression. Indigenous people live with these forces every day of their lives. Two aspects of settler colonialism and its kissing cousin, capitalism, that I want to talk about are how they bring about violence against the land and against women, because those are very much intertwined. When you hear indigenous people say that Earth is our mother, that is not just a quaint expression. I'm not just walking around being like Disney Pocahontas singing about the colors of the wind or something, okay? It is an understanding of how deeply connected we are. A traditional indigenous view, and we are not all the same, this is generalizing, but a traditional view is that the land and water are our lives, our communities, are entirely part of our bodies. They are not separated from our bodies. The water is part of our bodies. Everything is tied to land. How we treat each other, how we organize ourselves politically, how we treat the land. When we are removed from our land, when our land and water are abused, those are attacks on our bodies. By contrast, the constant demand of settlers is for property and expansion. Settler colonialism and capitalism reduce our relationships to land as being no more than relationships as property to be bought and sold and exploited. They often reduce people to property too. So stolen Africans became chattel slaves, and indigenous people became wards of the government who were not permitted to feed themselves and needed passes from the white agent to leave their reservations. The remaking of land and bodies into property were necessary for settlement onto other people's land. Native people were forced off those lands. Black people were landless, almost by definition, and very often worked the land for the settlers. When black people had land, it was because it was considered worthless, or because they were placeholders on the land, who could be removed if the white settlers wanted it. An example of that might be when the Gullah people were almost entirely removed from the islands where they lived for generations. We see this at play now in the gentrification that pushes black and brown people out of their communities. It was okay for them to live in and buy houses in a community at one point. Now they are no longer allowed to be there, right? Imani knows about this because Imani is a leading activist against gentrification in Brooklyn. Sometimes people say that gentrification is the new colonialism. It's not. Colonialism is the new colonialism. It hasn't ended, but the underpinnings of settler colonialism certainly have led to gentrification, right? The capitalist desire for profits at any cost and the settler colonial contempt for the land as a living being leads to every sort of environmental violence. The territory and bodies of water of certain communities are violated through resource extraction, waste dumping, toxic water, such as in Flint or on the uranium mining tainted Navajo reservation. This environmental violence is an attack on our physical bodies because of our relationship with the land and water and because of the consequences that we experience. Land is also viewed as being passive, awaiting the active extraction of resources and profits. Land is a woman, according to settler colonialism, in other words. Women's bodies, of course, are also viewed this way, as something to be exploited. Settler colonialism is heavily gendered. Many indigenous nations here had an understanding of people being more than one fixed gender, what we now call two-spirit people, thank you, and often viewed gender as fluid. In addition, some native nations had multiple genders, more than two. But the settlers imposed gender binaries, which was a direct attack on two-spirit people, as well as on the leadership of indigenous women. The very category of who is and who is not a woman is a tool of settler violence. The state uses gender violence to enforce white supremacy, anti-blackness, and settler colonialism. Native women are attacked to destroy our families and our nations. Our women are largely excluded even from colonial systems. For instance, relatively few women are bureaucratic chiefs of tribes. Settler colonialism uses gender to colonize through rape and sexual mutilation and the widespread sexual violence of the residential schools and in foster care. Capitalism, the economic system under which we live, commodifies our bodies and lands and resources. When we are viewed as property, we are given different valuations. People who are disabled or trans or LGBTQ or two-spirit are usually on the lowest rungs. The lives of indigenous women are considered utterly worthless. That is part of why it was perfectly acceptable to the US and Canadian and Peruvian governments to sterilize thousands of Native women not that long ago, in Puerto Rico too. We and our children are disposable. At the same time, indigenous women are fetishized as being exotic and readily available to white men. You just have to look at a costume catalog around Halloween or any other time to see all the so-called Pocahontas costumes that are in there. This violence spills into our family life too. More indigenous children are being put into the foster care system than were put into the residential and boarding schools years ago. This foster care is also done for profit, especially with all of the privatized foster care centers that exist now. Some of you may have heard of an issue that indigenous women have been raising throughout North America, and which Monica raised, which is that of missing and murdered indigenous women, girls, and two-spirits. That is actually not just a recent thing. It has been our reality since the invaders first came here. But I don't have time to go into that long history here. When talking about missing and murdered indigenous women, I want to note that it's really hard to come up with enough statistics. Indigenous people are often not counted for many things. This state, Massachusetts, for instance, does not count native opioid deaths or many other things. Sometimes I'll go looking for statistics and I can't find them because they don't exist. There's not even a database for national statistics for missing Indigenous women, even though statistics are compiled for women of other races. But I can give you some information. In the US, 84% of Native women experience violence, and 56%, at least, I think it's a lot more, of Native women experience sexual violence. While agencies often say that this is due to the violence of Native men, in fact, it is non-Natives who commit the vast majority of this violence. In Canada, Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered or missing than other women. We think that there are about 4,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, but don't have an exact number. We do know that Indigenous women are 4.3% of the population there, but they are 16% of murdered and the majority of missing women. Very often, these women are when they disappear, their disappearances are not even investigated by the RCMP, by the authorities. And in fact, many people believe that the police and Mounties, which are a national police force, contribute to this problem. Many Indigenous youth in cities such as Winnipeg are at particular risk for violence because of the conditions of their being removed from their families and stuck into a broken foster care system. In the 90s, Mexican women in Ciudad Juarez and the El Paso area were murdered by the hundreds, and many of them teens. There were serial killers there. They were just entirely disposable, and the authorities did not care. Femicide, that is the killing of women, is a huge issue throughout what is now called Latin America, and is common against those women who are trying to protect their lands and water in particular. Violence against Indigenous women is rampant in the areas of man camps. Those are the temporary housing camps with often hundreds of workers, temporary workers, that pop up where there is intense resource extraction, such as oil pipelines being put in or fracking. For instance, the number of sexual assault, domestic violence, and sex trafficking incidents in North Dakota tripled since 2008 because of all the man camps there. Someone there wrote recently, pipeline companies and the banks supporting them are essentially gambling Indigenous women for short-term profits. While bank and oil company executives worry about whether their children are going to make it into an Ivy League school, we worry about whether our children are going to make it home. There's a lot of linkage between pipelines and fracking and these man camps and the violence that takes place against Indigenous women. And it was something that was raised very strongly when we go up against pipelines such as the Dakota Access Pipeline or the KXL or the tar sands projects or any of these other projects that happen. I also, Monica, was thinking about the Me Too in the sense here and how the media has been covering it as being something that largely involves actresses, and it's not that actresses should not be sexually harassed or assaulted either. I noticed one of the things they didn't talk about is that a Native actress named Misty Upham was actually raped at the Golden Globe Awards. Like literally raped there by Weinstein's people, and it's been known for a few years, and she ended up being pushed off a cliff back home where she lives on her reservation and died. And she was a very promising and talented young actress. Most of you, I don't hear any of these Hollywood people talking about that, for instance. You know, I see relatively little coverage about what any of this means for oppressed and working class communities where this has been part of our lives for generations, certainly. So when people are having these discussions, I think we need to raise all of this and the sexualized exploitation of immigrant workers in particular, too. Mm-hmm. You know, I see, what's her name, Eve Ensler, and these other so-called feminists call for more police and prisons when they talk about how to end gender violence. And I want to say these are not my leaders. I don't think these are your leaders. We need to say that organizing against gender violence does not need to mean fighting for more cops and prisons, because we know what the ramifications of that are. We need to point out the role of imperialism and gender violence worldwide. And we need to call bullshit, oops, sorry, got kicked from here. And we need to call BS when settler countries such as the U.S. say that they are going to war to free women. Right? So our bodies, our homes that we have a right to protect, just as we have every right to defend the land and water. We need more than reforms. To stop being commodified and exploited, we need to overthrow capitalism, as Monica said. We need socialism as an economic system, and we also need to decolonize from settler colonialism. You know, anytime there's been a socialist revolution, one of the most important things has been to look at everything within the society, whether it's education or childcare or healthcare or just every aspect of society, and think about it and think about how it's informed by the bad economic system that people had before, and how it's informed by settler colonialism and all these ideas like about discovering people, things like that. And there's always a process, and it's an ongoing process of trying to change those things and of trying to clear out people's minds from all of that stuff that colonization has put into our brains. Because ending settler colonialism as well as capitalism needs to be a key part of ending gender violence too. Decolonization is about resisting the forces of colonialism that have perpetuated the subjugation and exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. It is engaged for the ultimate purpose of overturning the colonial structure and realizing Indigenous liberation, but I would say liberation for all of us. Because all of us are poisoned by settler colonialism and capitalism in this country. Every aspect of our lives and thought have been impacted. Fighting against gender violence, including especially violence against trans and two-spirit people, is an important part of decolonization. Within our own communities, we have important work to do to recenter two-spirit people. And when we work on behalf of Indigenous women and two-spirit people, we combat the imposition of colonial barriers. Ultimately, decolonization is going to lead to the return of control of the land to Indigenous peoples. You can... It has to. You can't overthrow capitalism and have socialism and not deal with the land question. The land question has primacy. This does not necessarily mean that everybody needs to leave. Sometimes people are like, oh, are we all going to be herded on reservations now? And all that. It's like, no, I don't think we have to do that. But it does mean that Indigenous people have the right to decide what happens, and it does mean that there's going to be an end to pipelines and fracking and all this other destruction that's happening. And I assure you that Indigenous women will be continuing to lead the way. Thank you.